The darkness thickened with each step. Yulia walked down the long corridor, dimly lit by the rare bulbs hanging from the ceiling. The dull, yellowish light seemed to add more decay to the surroundings rather than helping her see clearly. The air was thick with the scent of mold, old wood, and rust, making each breath heavy and difficult. She had no idea how she had ended up here, but her instincts screamed one thing: she had to find a way out before it was too late. Yulia stopped near a door, straining to listen for any sounds from behind it. A faint shuffling, as though something or someone was moving across the floor, sent shivers down her spine. Her hands trembled, and she felt the blood pounding in her temples. She opened the door. It led to a large, almost cavernous room, resembling a hospital ward, filled with old metal beds, some rusted, others draped with tattered linens. Something was moving on one of the beds. "Is someone there?" Her voice was quiet and trembling, but the echo of it seemed to stretch across the entire room. No answer, just that strange scraping sound. Yulia moved forward, carefully stepping over the scattered items on the floor: old syringes, metal trays, glass vials filled with murky liquids. She approached the bed where something was stirring and, holding her breath, lifted the old blanket. Beneath it lay a creature, not a human, but something disturbingly close to it. Its skin was gray and pallid, as though it had been long dead, and its eyes, they were vacant, with dilated pupils that betrayed no life. The creature stared at her, as if trying to comprehend what was standing before it. Yulia recoiled in horror. The creature began to stir, slowly rising, and she suddenly realized it wasn't alone. In the corners of the room, other figures began to move, slowly rising from their beds. They were identical to the first one, slow, awkward, and terrifyingly inhuman. Panic gripped her. Yulia turned and bolted toward the exit. She could no longer hear her own footsteps. Her pulse pounded too loudly in her ears. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening clang. But she knew that these creatures wouldn't be stopped by locks or barriers. Somewhere deep inside, she was sure that something far more terrifying lurked in this place than just the monsters. Her thoughts raced. How had she ended up here? What was this place? Ahead of her, a staircase loomed, leading down to a lower floor. Grabbing onto the railing, she stumbled down the stairs. As she descended, strange whispers filled the air, heightening her already overwhelming fear. It was as if the very walls were speaking to her. The lower floor was even more dreadful. There was no light, just faint beams from the ceiling that barely allowed her to see her surroundings. Her breathing became shallow when she realized this floor was different. The air was thick with the stench of blood and chemicals. The floor was sticky with some unidentifiable substance, making each of her steps produce a sickening squelch. Ahead of her stood another door, massive, made of steel with huge rusted hinges. It looked as though it had been sealed long ago. Yet Yulia knew instinctively that something crucial was hidden behind it, something that might provide her with answers. She gathered her strength and pulled the door toward her. The heavy metal slab groaned as it opened. Behind it was a narrow, dark corridor, illuminated only by faint fluorescent strips along the floor. The corridor seemed endless, stretching into some unknown void. She moved forward, trying to block out the noises coming from behind her. Her legs carried her faster and faster, though her mind screamed to stop. At the end of the corridor, another door appeared, ancient, wooden, and adorned with strange symbols. She didn't remember how she got so close to it, but she distinctly heard the soft voices behind it. They were calling her by name. Yulia whispered, a voice cold and emotionless, like the wind outside. "You've finally come." She didn't know who or what was speaking to her, but she couldn't resist opening the door. With trembling hands, she pushed it open, revealing a vast hall. In its center stood a large altar, and in the shadows around it were strange figures, seemingly watching her every move. They did not move, but she could feel their presence. The altar was covered in old books, notes, and candles burning with a steady flame. At the top of the altar was a small metal box. Slowly, Yulia approached it, feeling something unseen drawing her closer. Her fingers gently brushed the cold metal, when suddenly the voice from the darkness echoed again. "Open it." She couldn't stop herself. Opening the box was the only thing that mattered in that moment. When the lid lifted, she saw her own eyes. They stared back at her, cold, lifeless, yet reflecting her very face. Suddenly, the figures in the hall began to move. They approached her, surrounding the altar, their faces expressionless. Yulia tried to back away, but her legs refused to move. The shadows drew nearer, their hands reaching out, and the whispers grew louder and louder. "You've been here before." The voice became louder, as though it filled her mind. "And you will never leave." Her legs gave way, and Yulia collapsed onto the cold floor. Memories flashed before her eyes: this place, the altar, the shadows. She had been here before. She was part of it. She had created this place when she came here willingly, searching for answers to her own questions. But now, the answers had found her. Her body was frozen in place as the last of the shadows surrounded her, and the eyes in the box, like two dead mirrors, continued to reflect her fear.